Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, breadwinners, thread spinners, you're now watching the TNF podcast with your favorite bipolar rock and roller, Mr. J. Curtis Strickland. Do me a favor, click on that subscribe button, click on the little bell for notifications, like this video, comment, and then we've got my merchandising company, Hell's Heart Merch Co. You can go there at hellsheartco.bigcartel.com, put in the code 20 for 20% off your entire order. And my next guest, I want to introduce today. A really interesting man. I'm glad I was able to get in touch to be able to do this. He has had an extensive history in Hollywood, acting, writing, directing. He created a whole slew of blaxploitation films. Just recently, I watched this film, Butterfly, with Stacy Keach and Pia Zadora. It was a really, really interesting, really controversial film. And he was also the creator of the original Glow series back in the 80s. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Matt Cimber. How are you today, Matt? Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Matt Cimber. How are you, Matt?
I'm feeling very good right now. For 88 years old, I'm moving up.
You're doing fantastic. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your.
That was 70 years ago. 70 years ago, and a lot of stars and a lot of different kinds of things that happened to me. I'm known as somebody who had led 9 lives. I went from one kind of thing to another thing to another thing. I started out teaching and learning. I was 14 years old when I went to Carnegie Hall, thanks to my sister, and I studied with the Russians, okay? The Russians were phenomenal in drama and theater, okay? And the woman's name was Maria Spenskaya, Michael Chekhov. Michael Chekhov is considered almost like Stanislavski, okay? And I was 14 years old. I got there purely by accident. My sister was at Juilliard studying opera. She used to take special lessons at Carnegie Hall. In the back of Carnegie Hall, they had studios that you could rent privately. It was very famous. So my mother wouldn't leave me alone, okay, on a Saturday morning. So I had to go with my sister to one of her classes. And in those days, Carnegie Hall didn't have any air conditioning. So I sat in the hallway, and across the hall, the door was slightly open, was the studio of this famous teacher. And she saw me sitting on the floor. She was about 80 years old herself at that time. And all her students were famous, well-known actors from Broadway who met on Saturday mornings. She came and invited me to come and sit inside the room instead of on the floor. Before you know it, at 14 years old, I was integrated because she liked me and I was fascinated by what I was seeing. They would rehearse the scenes all week long, and then on Saturday morning, Michael Chekhov, who was her husband, would come in and he would redo the scenes and stage them for more intensity, more meaning. And when I was 14, this was fascinating for me. And I used to watch the scenes very carefully. And before you know it, I was sitting, running lines for the actors who had scene study. and running lines for the actors who had scene study. And he would come in at the end, and I would fascinated at what he would do with the actors to find more expression and more intent. From that point on, I decided I wanted to be a director. At 14, that was quite an accomplishment, but in either event, I didn't direct anybody, but I used to run their lines for them and stay involved. And I stayed with her for the next 5, 6, 7 years. I went to school at Poly Prep in New York. I started getting a different kind of education than the one I started with, which is Little Italy. I would have become something maybe that I really enjoyed working with these famous actors from Broadway. And eventually I took it to kind of correct them or do lead. I ended up finding a way to get my own show, my own play to do. That was by the time I was about 19. I directed my first off-Broadway play in New York. And from there, I started doing more off-Broadway plays until finally someone said, man, I think you got to do some on Broadway. By that time, I was 21 or 22, which was unheard of at the time. And I did a play with, what's her name? I did a play with Sandy Dennis, okay? And it was her first play. I found her at the Actors Studio, and I started using her in the play, and she got really famous. She ended up doing a film with Elizabeth Taylor, but she got nominated for an Academy Award. And so from that time, I started leaping from different things that I did, which was I ended up doing about 11 off-Broadway plays. And then I did 5 or 6 on Broadway that were revivals. And I was by that time about 23. And I read I still wasn't making any real money. But then I heard that Jane Mansfield was coming to revive Bus Stop, the play Bus Stop. So I quickly read the play, and I went to my friend at William Morris Agency, and I said, look, I'd like to direct this. He said, Matt, he said, this is Hollywood coming here now. He said, you have to understand they're connected right back to Hollywood. Nobody selects directs for them except them. So I said, well, what should I do? He said, well, you got to get her to say that she wants you to direct it. He said, the best I could do for you is introduce you to her and see how she feels about it. So he said, I know you're capable enough to do it. So sure enough, I got an interview with the great Jane Mansfield, who was coming to stay in New York overnight to take a plane to Italy to make a film. And so I waited in the lobby of the hotel. She eventually showed up, came in with some character, and I introduced myself, and she said, hi. She says, I'm sorry, I hope you haven't been waiting too long. I said, no, 2 or 3 hours, that's all. Anyway, we went up to her suite. She said, "Look, I have to really do this fast because uh, she said I have to get up early to catch a plane for Italy." She was making a film with Maurice Chevalier, and she said, "I think I better get to bed early." So we talked for a while, and all we talked about was Broadway. She never said anything about Bus Stop and the fact that she loved Broadway. And finally, at the end of the evening, the end of half an hour, she said, "I think I have to hit the sack." I said, "Fine, very nice meeting you." Meanwhile, we never mentioned the play or whether I would direct it. And finally, before I left the suite, I said, "Look, uh, how do you feel about maybe me directing?" She said, "How do you feel about maybe me directing?" She said, "Oh, your agent told me. You're very good." She said, "You direct the play." I said, "Oh, really?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." I said, "I'll see you back here on Broadway in September." In any event, I said, "What about the casting?" I said, she said, "Well, you're the director, you cast it." So I cast all New York actors who eventually ended up in Hollywood and famous as supporting cast for her. When she came back, we had a rehearsal hall on 48th Street in Broadway, and she I knew she had arrived for the rehearsal when I looked out the window and there was a massive crowd on Broadway surrounding her. They saw her getting out of a cab. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, she came upstairs, and I had one of the actors to have a copy of a play for her. She came in and she sat down. I said, "Look, I have a copy of the play for you." She said, "Oh, I have it." She said, "Besides, I know the lines." All right. Hello? Could this be true? And sure enough, we rehearsed the play. And by the time we finished the tour, one of the young girls that was in the play, she invited to come to California and stay at her. I don't know if you ever heard of her spectacular mansion in Beverly Hills, but it was incredible. And she said, "And Matt, if you'd like to come," she said, "I'll introduce you around." She knew everybody naturally at 20th Century Fox, which was her studio. And so I went out, and she came. She didn't even belong to a union. The first night, the second night, Jane invited me to come to a typical Hollywood party, which was at some. I said, "Fine, but I don't know anybody." She said, "Oh, don't worry." She said, "I'll introduce you. When you come in with me, they'll all know you." And that was it. And the little girl, the actress, at the time, Sidney Poitier was ready to do a very famous uh, play that became the talk of the industry because he was a black actor, and this was his first big major film, Patch of Blue, in which he meets a blind girl. Every actress in Hollywood was trying to get that role. It was a prime role that year. I had a friend, Pedro Berman, who was a major producer at MGM. I called him up And I said, listen, now nobody knew me in Hollywood, but I had met him at a party. And I said, I have an actress here who is sensational. He said, all right, well, get her over here. Let's talk to her. She got into a talk with him and she got the role. She didn't belong to any union, anybody. It was amazing. He got her in the play, into the film, okay, and she got nominated for an Academy Award. I was very lucky because Jane was very popular at the studio. She, everybody knew her, all the crews, all the people in the music department, the photography, costuming, construction. And she said, you know what? She said, I think that since you've never done movies, really, she said, you ought to spend at least 2 weeks in each of these departments when they're on work. She said, and I know all the guys, they'll teach you everything. Now, these people that were at Fox at that time were people who lived through the 30s at the beginning of film. And it was amazing. Every one of them was so happy. I worked with editors, I worked with photographers, I worked in costuming, I worked in everything. And it was the greatest experience of my life because anybody offers me to learn something, I'm anxious about it. So I did it. And that anybody offers me to learn something, I'm anxious about it. So I did it. And that really kicked me off. My problem was that I was associated with Jane. My problem was that no matter what I did, I still was an outsider in Hollywood. I came from New York. I was a New Yorker. And then there was a photographer that I met who was about to make a very sexy movie, but it was a document. He said, you want to come and direct it? He said, and I was so anxious to get behind the camera, I went and I did the job. The producer was a very famous publisher, and he published all these books. And so I did it. Now, what I made in 3 films with him was what we would call R-rated. When I finished with him, I stopped doing it. I wanted to start making regular films. He said, well, he had control of the films and he added other footage that gave it a different connotation. Then Life magazine, called The Life magazine, I still have copies of it, did a picture story on me directing the plays, the films, and it was 2 pages in the center of Life magazine. Here I was up on a hill directing what the author called pornography. I had never done pornography or anything like it, and it put a big a big stone on me to get started other ways. But I did get, I started working with Mario Puzo, and I worked with him for 3 years. I would correct him. He had a great feel for a novel, for writing a novel. There's a huge difference between writing a novel and writing a screenplay. And I read one of his screenplays that he was working on. I read one of his screenplays that he was working on, and I understood what his problem was. Thank God to Poly Prep, which is where I got my basic education in writing. And sure, I directed Rex Harrison in his first play, first film after winning the Academy Award for My Fair Lady, which was a great honor. But of course, a lot of it had.
I knew you did the whole blaxploitation genre. How did you get involved into that, and what kind of like drew you to those
Well,
that genre of films?
I realized there were so many good black actors that nobody ever used because they were playing maids or chauffeurs or you know the point was that there was no room for them. So I decided that I was going to make one black picture, and I was going to use 6 famous football players from every different city in the United States where they were famous. Mean Joe Green, a whole group. And I had this agent in Beverly Hills who I say, and he represented a lot of them for their commercials and stuff. And I said, look, I'm going to do this film called The Black Six. When I was in Poly Prep, I loved the story of the charge of the Light Brigade. You know, a group of men that went in and, okay. So I based The Black Six on the charge of the Light Brigade. Of course, if I told the black actors about this, they never heard of the charge of the Light Brigade. But I adapted these 6 football players into that same base. I don't know if you ever saw the Black Six, but that was the whole idea, was the fact that they went to save somebody else and to, okay. Well, that picture opened on Broadway. And the distributor invited me to come to New York for the opening. And in those days, the plays opened on Broadway on Friday nights, not on Wednesday nights. So I went to spend the weekend. They got me a tower room at a hotel right on Broadway. And I looked down, and wouldn't you know, opening day, the place was steaming with rain. But only rain is only New York can get it in chunks. And I looked out on Broadway, and here was every major studio opening their films. And we had the film right across the street from the Paramount on 43rd Street and Broadway. And they had a banner that went from the sidewalk up to 60 stories, the Black Six. When I went to the window to look on Broadway, down on my left was the theater. It was the Lowe's Theater, which was a popular theater. The line waiting to go in that theater went all the way around the block in the rain. Every other theater from the major studios, there was nobody in the rain. And that told us the problem was black films never played in white theaters. back then. So when I saw the numbers coming in, and my film was rated third or fourth in variety, in gross numbers, I decided to make another black film. And it was called The Candy Tangerine Man. The first time I met Tarantino, he said, I know your films. He said, I studied them early. He said, and Samuel Jackson, who works in all the Tarantino pictures, told him that the Candy Tangerine Man was his favorite film. It's a wild film. I mean, we just threw all the things out the window, and it got an R rated, but it did tremendous. I made the film for about, I guess, about 500,000. And I wouldn't give it to a distributor. I wouldn't give it to one of those thieves. I went out. I had my own office in Hollywood by then. I went out and I bought 50 prints. I had 50 prints of the films made. And then I went to every different city where there was a heavy black insurgent of people. And I gave each one of those cities the 50 prints and got my cash directly from them. When I opened in New York, it was unbelievable. In Chicago, we opened on the Circle. In Chicago, 9 o'clock in the morning, the theater was jammed. Okay? So it was this thing that kept going. Then I made a picture with Lola Falana that Samuel Jackson.
Tarantino.
Huh?
Tarantino.
No. Sammy Davis Jr. put up the money. He told me he wants me to make a film built around Lola Falana. I don't know if you know who Lola Falana was, but she was the hottest singer in Hollywood. She played in Las Vegas. She was the highest paid girl. Nobody would put her in a film. So he said, I want to make her a film actress. So I wrote a script called Lady Coco. And that was my third black film. It did tremendously well. And then one day I came home to my office, and sure enough, on the stairs walking up to my office on Sunset Boulevard, there were all black students sitting there protesting. And I said, what's the problem? I had to walk over them. I said, well, why? They said, because you don't know enough about the black background to be able to make black. I said, if you feel that strongly about it, I won't make the films anymore. Because they were sweeping America on grosses. And there were a lot of black actors in there who were sensational. So I stopped making the black films. And then I made Hundra. Have you ever seen Hundra?
I have not.
Well, Hundra was the first film I did with Ennio Morricone. He did the music. Hundra was a huge grossing film, and it was about a girl who lived in ancient times. It was all fantasy. And when I took it to Ennio in Rome, I brought him the film. We went to his apartment and he put it on the machine and he looked at it and I said, "Oh my God, he's going to faint when he sees this film." He fell in love with it. And he looked at me when it was over. Luckily, I speak Italian. He looked at me, he said, "È un commedia." Now, this was based Conan. He looked at it, he says, "È un commedia." He didn't speak English at all back in those days. I said, "Sì, è un commedia." He said, "Oh." And he wrote a score that was fantastic. And Hundra was an enormous hit. And then I used him again in another film. I used him in two other films. We did three films together. He was always very much part of that clique of Ennio Morricone and Sergio Leone, and through him, he did the score for Butterfly, which was a film I did later, a little. Orson Welles I knew for 30 years. When I was working off Broadway, I took over the 41st Street Theater and I was always broke. So they told me you could have Monday nights. The theater was direct. I said, okay, I'm going to do a poets section. Okay. And the admission is going to be $3. And it's going to be an evening of poetry. And I'm going to go along Broadway, get all the stars of Broadway shows who are all hungry to do poetry and tell them to come and work free. That was a very ballsy thing. Anyway, I said, who is the number one person for poetry is Orson Welles. Orson was on Broadway and he was doing Othello and he broke his leg. So he was doing Othello in a wheelchair. So I called his agent. I said, listen, I'd like to ask him if he would work free. And the agent said, you want me to hang up on you? Are you out of your mind? He said, you want to see Orson? Go to the theater where he was playing Othello. I went to the backstage of the theater and I went up to the guy handling the door. I said, I'm here to meet Mr. Wells. He said, I have no notation of that. I said, well, no, then you want to ask him? He said, I don't want to go near his dressing room. So sure enough, I asked him if he wanted to come and do it. And he finally called me up a few days later. This was awesome. And he said, listen, I'll do it. He said, but I'm going to tell you, no other person could do poetry that night except me. It's all me, my poetry. Are you kidding? It's a pleasure. Orson Welles working for me. Now, as soon as he said, okay, we set a date, he sold out naturally the first night, and then he had to leave again for Italy. He had to go to Italy to make a film with Tyrone Power, or some crazy thing he did. Anyway,
And we were talking about the film Butterfly, and that was one of the ones that I got to watch, and it's very controversial subject matter. And my question, I guess, to you would be, how did the actors feel about working with such a story?
I got friendly with a man named Meshulam Riklis, who was an Israeli billionaire, and he had a wife. Oh boy, did he have a wife. Her name was Maria.
Pia Zadora.
Pia Zadora. Pia Zadora. And she was a handful. He owned the Riviera Hotel. That was a place. He took over Pia's career. Took over. He put all the money into her career, and he was determined to make her. He had a manager that used to be the road manager for Frank Sinatra. Okay? This is how I got. He wanted her to have a screenplay. So I knew his name was Tino Bozzi. Tino called me and said, Matt, my boss wants somebody to find a property for Pia Zadora. Well, I remember reading a very famous author who wrote a lot of very famous films, very famous films. And I remember a producer at Fox that had the rights to that. I called him right away. I knew this was a chance to make a score of money. So I called him up. I said, listen, you got this film, you got this book, the rights to the book. You haven't been able to produce it. Now, how much do you want for the rights? He obviously was hungry. Even if he was working at Paramount, he wasn't making any money. He said, I'll take 25,000 cash for the rights to the book. I said, oh, okay, hang on. So I went to a dinner with Riklis and with Tino Bozzi, and we were sitting talking. I said, look, I have a great name author whose films have won Academy Awards. I said, I can get the rights to a play, a film that for 25,000, what the hell was 25,000 for, Rickless it would be a joke. And he said, okay, go get the rights. So I called the guy. I said, look, I got 25,000 for you. Let's meet on Friday. I'll get you the cash, turn over the paperwork to the lawyer. And he did it. Sure enough, we got the rights. Now I have another meeting with Rickless to present the paperwork to him. And he said, now let me ask you something. I looked up about you. He said, who do you think should direct this? I said, there's great directors throughout Hollywood. You could hire any. He said, remember something. With my money, I could buy the best director, the best actors, the best. I don't have to worry about what the cost is going to be. He said, you don't want to direct this? I said, I don't know. I said, yeah, maybe you want a famous director, somebody who has a higher rep than me. He said, well, we'll talk about this later. He said, but I'd like you to work on the film. I said, well, all right. He said, but I'm going to charge you for it. He said, I hope so. That meant in his mind, that meant I worked for him. That's all he ever cared about. And that's how we started. Meantime, Reckless at the Riviera Hotel, he had, what's his name, the guy I never liked. He said, I want you to take this screenplay to Kenny Rogers to play the father. I said, Kenny Rogers? You know, Kenny Rogers to play the lead in Butter. They thought about Stacy Keach to play the father. I said I could go off after Orson Welles. So Orson Welles is my neighbor in Los Angeles. I left the screenplay in his uh, mailbox, and I'm working at the Riviera, and I get a call. It's Orson. Orson says, Matt, he said, you expect me to play this guy? He says, I couldn't even fit in the truck. He said, I weigh over 400 pounds. Are you crazy? So I lost her. I said, well, what do you think of Stacy Keach? He said, Stacy would be great. I want you to play the judge. He did it. And he hired those two. And that was it. And of course, we were stuck with Pia Zadora. But I worked with Pia a lot. And Pia has more talent than most people think. And I think she did a terrific job in the film. I mean, I took her, rehearsed her scene by scene by scene until it was driven in her. And I hired actors who were so sensational, I knew they could handle their roles. I knew exactly how Stacy would play every role, and that's exactly what I want. My concentration was on Pia. And she did a great job. You know, now we hear students and people who are interested in films, they watch Butterfly and they say, man, the picture's a hell of a film. Variety said that it was the best $2 million film they ever saw. That's a nice review.
Yeah, definitely. And you had mentioned that you had worked uh with Ennio Morricone. I mean, that is.
He was sensational. He had one theory, and the theory was all his music emanated from nature. He said, I would listen to nature. He put the microphone anywhere, and he said the basis was nature. He said, that's where I drew everything. And I went scene by scene by scene with him. Took us 3 days on each film. Then he directed the orchestra. And we worked in a church choir for all the films. He had his studio in a Catholic church in Rome. And he had his special musicians that always worked for him. He's kind of an amazing man. And Sergio, who he did all his films, Sergio said, "Oh, he's crazy. Don't worry." He said, "You'll get him to do your films." and he did them.
That's awesome. I love his music so much. And you were credited as being the creator of the original Glow, which I actually didn't know that there was an original. I knew about the newest series that they had these past few years. Did you have any sort of influence on any of that production? Did they come to you, or how did that work? Did you have any interaction with that?
He's asking about what interaction did you have with Netflix on their production of Glow?
What? Nothing really. They had no right to do what they were doing, but they wanted me to go hire a lawyer, pay $500,000. The name of Irv Hollander?
No.
Well, he's a distributor. He's the biggest bandit that ever lived. They're all bandits, but they're the biggest. And he tried to lay claim. The guy who came up with the idea of Glow was a young guy from Chicago who's hung up his whole life. Rickless called me and said, I want you to do the show that this guy is talking about for the Riviera. I'll advertise it all through the country. I said, Rick, I'm not for wrestling. I really don't want to do this. But I owed Rick a lot. And I said, okay, I'll do the pilot. After that, no more, I thought. So I did the pilot, and I put all this comedy into it. I made it a show. And when they saw it, the guy who came in with, what was his name?
Irv Hollander?
No, the other guy, who was the David McLean and Irv Hollander joined together. And they called Rickless and they said, we just saw the pilot. They said, this show will be the biggest failure of all time. They said, who allowed Matt Cimber to put that comedy into it? Don't they know? They tried to get me fired. And they told Rickless, we want you to fire. This is on the phone. And while he had me on the phone in the Riviera, they were sitting in his office with him, and so they could hear everything that was going on, right? He said, you sure? He said, yes, we want you to fire him. We'll find somebody who knows what women's wrestling should be about. He said, well, I'm sorry, fellas. They were asking him for $500,000 to start the producing of the shows. And he said, well, let me tell you something. I put my faith in Matt Cimber. He said, I'm not giving anybody else $500,000 to do what they please. I don't know anything about women's wrestling, but everybody's looked at the pilot, thinks it's very funny and very good. That was the whole idea. Because wrestling at that time was the number one show. I was working in Europe. I had been in Europe for almost 3 years. And when I came back, Rick said, I want you to do this wrestling show. I said, whoa. I said, no way. And he strong armed me and said, you'll do the pilot. And after the pilot, they took it to the festival. And the first week, 8 stations bought it. That was in September. By the time January came, we had 108 stations. It swept America, you know? And of course, Rickles, after that, anybody asked him, oh, I finance Glow, right away. All of a sudden, he loved the show, you know. But in either event, I ended up liking the show because I liked most of the girls. They were really good square. When the first day that we called for auditions, okay, not one legitimate actress ever showed up. They were girls wrestling. Are you crazy? Back then, that was it. Every girl I had that I started with had no experience except one or two girls in wrestling. They had to be trained, and they have never did comedy, which is the toughest thing in the world to do. I taught them how to do takes, how to do this stuff. We went through everything, and those girls pulled it off. They pulled it off. I had, at the end of the tally, in 4 years, I had 75 girls. All I had to create characters for each one of them. And they lived by them, and they were fantastic. And till this day, they're on the internet. People are always contacting them. Always, and little girls sit there, and the woman says, I was a little girl when I saw Glow the first time, and I loved it forever. It was amazing. Amazing.
Awesome. That's awesome. What are you doing to stay busy nowadays? You guys just moved to Nevada here recently. What do you do to stay busy like in your daily routine? What's like a day in the life like?
Well, what is a day in your life like? What are you doing to stay busy? You could talk about the documentary.
I haven't told you about all the people I've been involved. I got Frank Sinatra stories that are hysterical. Orson Welles stories that are incredible. I mean, incredible. I got friendly with Frank and I got friendly with Dean.
Dean Martin's.
Telly Savalas was a close buddy of mine. They were terrific guys.
So you're writing a book and you're doing a documentary then?
Yeah, my story doesn't talk about the shit that goes on in Hollywood. I know enough of that. I'm not going to put any of that in the book. I'm only going to put funny, incredible things.
Sure.
You know,
And the documentary
not
is going to be
my buddy Johnny Russo. I don't know if you know Johnny Russo, but Johnny Russo wrote a book that he's lucky he's still alive. I don't want to write that kind of book. It isn't
right.
worthy of it.
Yeah.
Really.
No, I understand. I understand. Uh So, when can we expect to see the book and the loved having a conversation with you. I think you've got a lot of really rich stories, and we'll definitely be looking forward to the documentary. And I just wanted to thank everybody that tuned into the show. Do me a favor, click on that like button, click on the subscribe button, click on the little bell for notifications, share this video. That would greatly help me in the algorithm. And if you can do me a favor and go on over to hellsheartco.bigcartel.com, you can buy any one of our cool little shirts that we have over there, movie themed t-shirts. So if you like that, you'll like those. So everybody, I want to thank you